Okay, so we already talked a little bit about diversity in the last video. Just don't forget that a niche is the job or the role that the organism does. So for example, we talked about resource partitioning and like where in this they live. So this bay-breasted warbler lives at the bottom, this black-berrien warbler lives at the top. And so each occupies a different job or a different role. It lives in a different place and has a slightly different job, and therefore that decreases that competition. If we lose habitats, we lose biodiversity, okay? So like no organism wants to live here. It's not gonna have the resources that an organism needs in order to survive. Here we still see some parcels, but it's very broken up. If you're an insect, this is like a situation you can't overcome, okay? It's insurmountable. If you're a mammal, like a bigger mammal, it's probably fine. If you're a smaller mammal, it's gonna be rough. If you're a bird, you're probably okay. But what we want to say is we need to preserve these habitats. Remember that we talked about like species that live here on the edges, like they're going to be fine. These species that live here in the core are not going to be fine. So edge species tend to like it when we have like little pockets like this, but core species do not. Okay, so species that can live almost anywhere are what we call generalist species. So, and species that are very specific in their needs are specialist species. So for example, if you have a really broad niche, you're a generalist species, like a squirrel or a rabbit. They tend to be more adept to overcoming disturbances. Oops. A specialist, on the other hand, is very specific, like the panda that's going to appear here. They only eat bamboo. They're not going to be able to overcome a disturbance because they're reliant on one specific thing, right? This bear can probably deal with lots of things. It's important that we have a variety of diversity within the species, and we talked about this in the last video. The more diverse a population is, the more resilient, the more it is going to be able to overcome any kind of disturbances. So right now, the cheetah population is not genetically diverse. They went through a bottleneck, and they are probably facing extinction in the next few years because they are unable to adapt to the habitat destruction that's going on. Okay, so Darwin said that organisms that have a variety of genes are more able to survive, and therefore they're more able to pass on their genes. And so this natural selection just says that two organisms are going to compete with one another. One is going to win out and pass those genes on. So the more variation you have, the better at competition, or the more competition there's going to be, and the better organisms are going to win out. Okay, don't forget we also talked a little bit like mutations are helpful most of the time. Well, I don't want to skip through this. I don't want to go through this. You don't need to know this. You might need to know like an adaptation. An adaptation is something that lets the organism survive. So for example, a moose that is able to eat a specific type of plant isn't going to have as much competition. Therefore, he's going to have this very specific niche, this very specific job or this role, and therefore he's going to be able to survive and reproduce as compared to, say, other elk or deer that are not able to do that. Okay, you don't need to know any of this, so I'm just going to skip through. So what we want to talk about with the cheetahs, though, is what we call a bottleneck. So a bottleneck is when there's a drastic decline in the genetic diversity of a population due to a sudden decrease. So maybe that's like half of them got separated from the other half, and therefore they went through this rapid mutation, and now they don't have very many genes. This can be caused most of the time by a natural disaster, sometimes caused by overhunting. Okay, and so pretty much there's not any genetic diversity. We see lots of inbreeding, lots of bad mutations. The population doesn't have this MVP, minimum viable population, and so they're not going to be able to survive, and they're not going to be able to reproduce. And so what we see is that in our zoos, we have an SSP, a species survival plan. And it's kind of like a matchmaking game for the organisms. We take the most diverse organisms, the ones that have the least genes in common, and we breed them in an effort to try to get more genetic diversity. So like we match them up. It's not like, oh, we're gonna put this cheetah and this cheetah together because we feel like it. They analyze their DNA and their genes, and they look, where's the most diversity and how can we breed them together to increase that diversity? So like I was saying, the cheetah population went through a bottleneck and is facing extinction, okay? we already kind of went through this. We can talk about species evenness and species richness, right? We talked about how species richness is having lots of different types of species, and species evenness is having lots of individuals within those species. In order to have biodiversity, you have to have both. Okay, so if we take a look at this one has 4 different types. This one also has 4 different types. So our species richness is the same. However, if we take a look at community 2, their evenness is not the same. This one is 70%, this one has 6, 12, and 12. So their evenness is low. This one has high richness and high evenness. This one is going to be more likely to survive and overcome any kind of disturbance. Okay. And I will let you go through these. I hope that this was helpful, and stay tuned for more.